How's it going?
Great.
How's it going?
Great.
Yeah. Pay attention. Yeah, I want to read a short story. But yes, if you're not doing anything all weekend long, you have nothing to do all weekend long, come to the conference. It starts tomorrow at like 8 a.m. with some workshops. That guy's going to be presenting, that guy's going to be presenting, she's going to be presenting, Shannon Ballum is going to be there, Darren Edwards is going to be there, all presenting, all giving great classes. There's a couple of other panels, there's a couple of other really great activities. You should come, you really should come. If for no other reason than to see our local poets, we've got the 3 big poets from Logan. If you're any kind of poet, you should probably be there. So I'm going to read this short story. This is called, I tried to come up with something that was a little bit end of summer, like end of the sunny days going into autumn, kind of that melancholy smile type thing. I hope you like this. This is called Too Soon for Guns. I don't know where Glenn got the idea that I would ever want to go pheasant hunting, least of all now. It's maybe because 6 years ago, I once said, I love pheasant hunting. But he never listened to a word I said back then, so it's not really my fault. Even if he was listening, Glenn had to know that I said it because I was engaged to his daughter at the time. Deanne loved me to death, of course, but I had to work much harder to impress Glenn and Helen and the others, so I said lots of stupid things. Everyone knows you don't listen to anything the fiancé says. The fiancé is the most pathetic suck-up you'll ever meet. Back then, if Glenn said, Ray, let's you and me get undressed and cuddle a while, I'd have unbuttoned my shirt and said, Glenn, that's just what I was thinking. I never won him over entirely, not like the other brothers-in-law did. Deanne and me didn't go to church, and we never had kids. We moved away for school. The other brothers-in-law were church-going farm boys who stayed put and wore their hair short. When they said they loved pheasant hunting, they meant it. That's why I spent a lot of time wondering where I stand with Glenn and Helen now that Deanne's gone. One of the first things Glenn said to me after she died was, I do not want you blaming yourself for this. It was a nice thing to say, but it was impossible to keep myself from thinking he was lying, because there's so much blame and guilt after a car accident. So I'd go over his exact words. He never said it wasn't my fault, he just said he didn't want me blaming myself, so should I anyway? He didn't want me to blame myself, but did he blame me? With Helen, it was a lot easier. As soon as we showed up for the funeral, she appointed herself my official spokesperson. When I'd shut down, she'd step in, like when I'd sit and dwell upon some stupid thing for 30 minutes, an hour. I thought a lot about the ambulance for some reason, how it was so grimy and old. Most ambulances are immaculate, brand new. Deanne's was in real bad shape. I'd sit thinking about what something like that means. And when one of the brothers-in-law would come over and tell me it was time for supper, I'd just go right on thinking. That's when Helen would materialize, pat my back and say, I don't think Ray's hungry right now. Glenn tried to absolve me, but I just couldn't trust him. He told me I should come and stay with him for a week after the funeral. I told him I'd stay for 2, just to see if he'd try to back out. He didn't. In fact, out of nowhere, he started calling me son all the time. He never did that before, and I could tell he was having a hard time getting used to it. He'd tack it on where it didn't fit, like maybe Helen had put him up to it. If you're going to use that downstairs toilet, he'd say, you got to jiggle the handle after you flush, son. Staying at Glenn and Helen's was hardest in the evenings after dinner. The house would get so quiet. Glenn and Helen wouldn't say much. Even the presence of their dead daughter's husband in the house couldn't break up their quiet dishwashing collaboration, their TV schedule. When the news was over, I'd go into the basement and get in Deanne's old bed. Helen had no compunction about bunking me there. Small, she said, but still a good bed. You can toss those stuffed animals on the floor. I'll pick them up later. A sodium arc lamp stayed on all night somewhere among Glenn's outbuildings, casting a shaft of light through Deanne's basement window like a stationary moonbeam. It lit up Deanne's little study desk and her ancient computer, Pearl Jam poster on the paneled wall. Taped to the mirror above her dresser, there were clippings from the local newspaper about her at the state track finals long ago. I could just make out her newsprint face, and I looked at it each night until I fell asleep. Mornings were a little better. I'd get up late, and Helen would have breakfast ready. We'd talk about things we might do, like take a trip together, the three of us. Then I'd go back to bed. Glenn didn't like that, so after a few days, he made me come with him while he walked his dog, Nixon. If you felt up to it, Glenn said one morning, you could help me do a brake job on that truck. Yeah, I yawned, pocketing my hands. I could hand you a wrench. He talked about other things we could do, but never did. A shed that needed painting, fruit trees that needed pruning. He even suggested we drive into Billings and check out the Custer Monument, but I know for a fact nothing was ever said about pheasant hunting. I don't love pheasant hunting. Technically, it's not even fair for me to say that I don't like it because I've never been pheasant hunting. I once answered yes when the brothers-in-law asked me, do you want to go pheasant hunting? And I spent time in their company while they shot up some pheasants. When I was in Scouts, I even fired a shotgun to get ready to hunt pheasant at some future time, but I've never actually posed a threat to any pheasant. Glenn didn't care about any of that. He never really asked me if I wanted to go. As we sat down for some of Helen's pecan waffles, he said, you up for all day? Yeah, I said, sure. Good, he said, nodding. After we eat, we'll go out and see if we can't shoot a couple pheasants, son. I looked up from the waffles, wondering if it was a good idea to go someplace remote while Glenn had a gun on him. No hurry, he said, whenever you're finished. It'll be good for us. I looked around for Helen. She took her appointed station at my side and patted me on the back. I waited for her to say, oh, Glenn, Ray doesn't want to do that today. But she didn't. And unless I was partially blind with grief, I'm pretty sure I saw her give Glenn a little nod before she turned and went to the kitchen. The only other woman in the room was Mrs. Butterworth, so I stared at her a while. She was of no help. She stood next to my plate, hands clasped across her generous, transparent waist with an expression that asked, will there be anything else? I went into Deanne's bedroom and looked through my suitcases for something warm enough to wear. All I had was a black hoodie. I got dressed and sat on the bed, listening to Glenn thumping around in his study. Where'd you put that green shoulder bag? Helen, did you move it? You put all that stuff in the garage, she called back. Soon Glenn knocked on the door. I opened it from where I sat on the bed. Glenn stood in the doorway in his wool cap and coat. He looked around inside but didn't come in, as if a barrier were still in place there, one that I was audacious enough to cross, but not him. I stood up, and he turned, and I followed him into his study. He produced a key and opened the gun locker. 20 gauge, 12 gauge, he pointed to each gun. 410, another 12 gauge, and that one's a 28. These birds will flush long, pick your poison. I didn't know it. Thanks, Owen. I didn't know if I should put some thought into my decision or if I'd been given enough information to choose already. There was a time when I knew what the numbers meant, but I couldn't ask for a refresher now. In a few more minutes, the wood stove heat of the house would melt Glenn in his hat and coat. He looked at his watch. 12-gauge shotguns were the only kind I had any experience with at all, but I assumed picking one of them was too easy, childish maybe. I considered the others, but had already forgotten which was which. Glenn chose one of the 12-gauge guns, the pump-action kind. Then he pulled open a drawer in the bottom of the locker and sorted through the ammunition there. You know, I said, maybe I'll just tag along. I don't even have a current hunting license right now. This was true, but I had never had a hunting license at any time. We can get you one at the filling station, said Glenn. He picked up the other 12 gauge, a double-barrel Winchester, and handed it to me. Here, just take that one. A half hour later, I was zoning out in Glenn's Chevy. The mist had retreated and the autumn landscape glowed with a coppery tint. After a while, Glenn slowed and pulled the truck. After a while, Glenn slowed and pulled the truck off the road. We're here, said Glenn, thunking the truck into park. We're where? I said. Here, he said. This is it. We looked out on a series of cropped hayfields lying in the sun like vast hemp doormats. Yeah, I said. This looks great. We got out of the truck. Nixon hopped down from the bed and stuck his nose in the dirt. Glenn came around and put the box of Remington shells on the fender. That enough for starters, he asked. You a good shot? Oh, I'm sure I'm a little rusty, I chuckled. Glenn loaded his shotgun and worked the pump to chamber a shell. He shoved a few shells in his pocket and stood staring at me. Shells? He asked. Right. I took 2 shells from the box, but couldn't open the gun with them in my hand, so I put them back. One fell out and rolled down the fender. I flinched to catch it, but Glenn snagged it first. He put it back in the box, then took hold of my shotgun barrel, which I had allowed to swing in the direction of his groin. I apologized and pointed the gun at the ground. Then I realized I didn't know how to load the gun at all, so I turned and tilted it blindly. "This is a lot different than what I'm used to," I said. Over the trigger housing there was a brass oval etched with a pheasant in flight. "Wow, Glenn, this is a really nice gun. You sure you want me messing with it?" "Here," said Glenn. He thumbed a lever situated in plain sight between the 2 barrels, and the gun fell open by the breech. "Right," I said. "Okay." For some reason I thought that was the safety. Glenn walked out into the morning. He whistled up Nixon, who snuffled down the edge of the field. I inserted a shell in each barrel, closed the breech, and the gun fired, blasting my father-in-law square in the ass. Glenn spun about and took one halting step, as though he might walk it off. Then he collapsed stiffly into the hay stubble. I dropped the gun and ran to him. Nixon barked at me ferociously, lunging, teeth clacking. Glenn's face was drawn into a terrible grimace, his lines and wrinkles tight and pale. I pulled off my hoodie to put under his head, babbling something I couldn't hear over Nixon's barking. "Nixie!" roared Glenn. "Enough! Sit!" The dog quieted down, and so did I. Nixon turned in a circle and sat, licking his chops in a pathetic, jittery way. Glenn's voice went to a sort of low buzz. "Ray," he said. "Yeah, Glenn. You've shot me in the ass." "I know I did. I'm so sorry." "Wasn't your fault," he said. "It was too soon for guns, maybe." "Maybe, yeah." "Ray?" "Yeah, Glenn. Wasn't your fault," he said. He looked me in the face. "I appreciate that, Glenn." I put my hoodie under his head, then I took out my phone and dialed. "Ray?" "Yeah, Glenn. I'm gonna pass out." "You're probably going into shock," I said. "Doesn't hardly surprise me. It's been a while since somebody shot me." I nodded at him and talked to the dispatcher. "Glenn, you're gonna be fine." "Yeah," he said. "I expect we both will be." Thanks.